This is another roundtable edition of Dentons Smart Cities and Connected Communities think tank. Our topic today is the Cleantech investment outlook for 2023. My name is Clint Vince, and I chair Denton's U.S. energy practice, and I co-chair our 1,200-member global energy sector for the U.S. with my teammate Emma Hand. And Emma and I also co-chair this Smart Cities think tank, which has now grown to more than 750 thought leaders from around the globe. And the good news is that we're going to go back next month to having hybrid meetings where we'll have in-face meetings in Washington, D.C., and a virtual feature for our other participants from all around the globe. I'm excited to get back to some of those live sessions. We're very honored to be once again hosting this webinar with the Keystone Policy Center as part of their Key Conversations program. Paula Gold-Williams is the chair of the board of Keystone. She is not able to be here with us today. She's out of the country, but she has sent a warm welcome via video. So I'm going to ask Brian if you can run that welcome and we'll get started.
Well, once again, it is my absolute pleasure to represent the Keystone Policy Center in our partnership with Dentons. The opportunity that we have to partner with them on their Smart Cities think tank is extremely important to Keystone. What we do is we bring forward conversations, and today is no different. So I want you all to sit back, enjoy, learn. There are so many things that are important to what we're trying to do to decarbonize energy right now in this industry, and taking inventory of what's new and on the horizon is very important. So enjoy.
Thank you, Paula, from afar. And we're going to get underway now with this extraordinary panel. And I'm going to ask each of our panelists to just take a minute or two to introduce themselves. Their experience and achievement could take properly a 10 or 15 minute introduction, probably just to list the awards they've won and recognition. But let's start with Jeff Weis, the founder and executive chairman of Distributed Sun.
Thank you, and thank you, Clint and Emma, so much for today and for including me and to Dentons and to the Keystone. I'm very grateful. I'm Jeff Weis. Chase Weir and I co-founded a company called Distributed Sun 14 years ago. And as the name implies, we've developed, owned, and operated solar of every size, literally, and throughout the value chain during that period of time. As we've evolved into the current space, we continue to build a lot of solar at scale, and we've become the energy transition partner for Fortune 500 companies. So that, as we'll talk in the next hour, involves an extension into fleets and mobility and charging and storage, in addition to, and other technologies in addition to the classic solar generation. So thank you for including me.
Thank you, Jeff. Claudia, would you like to introduce yourself next?
Yes, thank you. I would be happy to, and thank, as well as Jeff said, I'd like to thank Clint and Emma and the Denton team. It's a tremendous honor to be here today. So my background is in finance and deal structuring, M&A. I've had an amazing journey through various industries, and came into the energy industry and public-private partnerships in about 2001. I was part of a major real estate development and construction firm, leading both of those initiatives, and then part of a division of EDF, as well as Alpha Structure. Currently, I am a senior strategic advisor for DIF Capital Partners, which is a global infrastructure fund with over 20 billion euro under management, supporting them in one of their three key pillar areas, which is investments in North America in the energy transition. So great to be here. Lots of interesting topics to cover.
Thank you, Claudia. And Bob Powell, would you like to go next, please?
I'd be delighted. And also thanks, Clint, Emma, and the Dentons team for being here. Really appreciate the partnership from a business perspective and this opportunity as well. So I'm the founder of Brightmark. We founded Brightmark in 2016. And the focus of Brightmark is really around taking some of the most prevalent waste streams we have that I believe are the root cause of environmental outcomes that we don't want. So at Brightmark, sort of circular innovation application of technologies is how we do that. Two primary waste streams we tackle here: organic waste, which creates an immense amount of greenhouse gases via methane, as well as nutrients that run off and create issues both in local water tables and in large bodies of water like algae blooms. The second thing we do is we have a technology that was originally invented in the 80s and is patented that takes plastics in a fully circular fashion. We're able to recreate the building blocks to make plastic products. So our goal is full circularity. And from a personal standpoint, career progression, was a partner at Anderson and PricewaterhouseCoopers, where I spent most of my time working on energy projects and structuring of those. Left and joined Pacific Gas and Electric Company and became the chief financial officer of the utility there right as we were getting started in renewables. Left there to run my first company, which was a solar distributed generation company. So a progression for my career in terms of clean tech and clean energy to where we are now at Brightmark.
Thank you, Bob. And Stephen, you're our anchor panelist. If you would introduce yourself as well.
Sure. And thanks, Clint and Emma, Dentons, and Keystone for the opportunity and the chance to join this conversation. So Steve Comello, I'm a senior vice president here at the EFI Foundation, or the Energy Futures Initiative. And that's a DC-based think tank, energy and environmental think tank that was started by my boss, former Secretary of Energy, Ernie Moniz, back in 2017. And we are nonpartisan, philanthropically funded. And we spend a lot of time thinking about innovation and harnessing technological and policy innovation to bring about the deep decarbonization that we need to achieve by mid-century. I spent a lot of time actually spending on the finance, looking at the finance piece of that. If you look at the statistics, we need an immense amount of capital to get us where we need to go. And I'm thinking about various actionable policy recommendations to crowd in various capital providers and unlocking various capital structures and funnel them into this space. Before this, I've been with EFI for about a year now. Before this, I was a faculty member at Stanford Business School for about a dozen years, an engineer by training, and spent a lot of time on cost optimization and policy analysis. So happy to be here and looking forward to the conversation.
Thank you, Steve. And I'm very honored to serve on Steve's board with Ernie Moniz and a number of other really great people in the industry. Jeff, I've had the pleasure of hearing you give an overview on the current market for clean tech. Whenever I listen to you, I always learn something new. So why don't we just let you get underway?
Thank you. Thank you all. Thank you again very much. So today is about the clean tech investment outlook in 2023. And what I want, if you're going to take one thing away, you should all know we're at a moment of great generational change. This is the most exciting time to be in the business we're all in. The energy of tomorrow is the energy of today. And clean tech has moved from what it was 10 or 20 years ago, which was the esoteric table, to being the grown-up table. And what's helped it move that way from a capital markets point of view is the levelized cost of energy. So almost everything we do is in the money, and as we do it, the capital markets support it. From renewable generation to new bio-derived fuels to fleet electrification, to smart transmission upgrades, to innovative methods of carbon capture, smart traffic signals, LED streetlights, low carbon concrete, new forms of refrigeration. This quiet technological revolution is upgrading our infrastructure. So clean tech is a very broad word. It's not a specific thing. This transition is, however, is taking decades. At the end of the day, the final 20% of carbon abatement has a very long tail, and the various technologies will be with us for a very long time. The key to change, if all this is about change, this quiet technological revolution, is actually integration. The key to change is integration because each of those types of technologies exist somewhere and are being financed and deployed. And some of them are being deployed as silos by themselves, and most of them exist in society adjacent to or together with another technology. So therefore, if the key to change is integration, what has to be integrated for each of them are the technologies, the policies, and the capital markets. Because $0 ever get deployed for anything if all three of those don't come together. And there's a lot of people who work on technology, there's a lot of people who work on policy, and there's a lot of people who work on capital markets, but quite often they don't understand and see that they need to integrate together in order to get things to the goal line. Driving all this are things like permits and interconnection and transmission. So there are a lot of gating rules, and you can't invest $1 unless the project is permitted. You can't invest it unless it's ready to be connected to the grid in whatever its way is. And if it involves electrons, which most things in clean tech do, they got to get from point A to point B, and you need the pipes, you need the transmission to do that. So underlying integration is a lot of work on permitting, interconnection, transmission that I know we'll get into in the next hour and a half. In the capital markets per se, capital is really easy, right? Money is about risk and return. Every dollar has a required return, and every technology has its own inherent risk. The great thing about the energy markets and the clean tech corner of the energy markets, which is now grown up table because of our lowest levelized cost of energy, is that energy is a long duration, low risk asset. So you don't invest in an energy asset and put all that money in for a year. You invest in that energy asset for years or decades, and the capital markets actually really like something that used to be called bonds, right? So what we're doing is we're kind of in the energy world inventing bonds, which are low duration, long risk assets. And in this transition, what we need to do is increasingly simplify the complex mix of technologies so that they can be financed and they can be interoperated. Fortunately, government has stepped up, and it stepped up in a generational way that it never has in the last many decades, right? The combination of the IRA, the DIF, and the CHIPS Act are talking about support, some of which is direct investment, but a lot of which is through the tax code and through credits and those kinds of things. But the aggregate of that support is $2 trillion. That $2 trillion, if it all gets deployed, will support $8 trillion of total capital. That's an astronomical sum, and that amount of infrastructure will in fact change society and change our generation. I wanted to go one level deeper into the cost of capital. So despite everything I said, or in view of everything I said, there's a report card, which is what's the interest rate, which is what a cost of capital is. So for everything that one invests in and everything that someone supports, a bank or investment firm, they always have a required return and a cost of capital. And the interesting thing in the last 2 years, the last 3 years, interest rates in our economy have gone up a lot, right? So if interest rates have gone up a lot, by definition, the cost of capital for everything has gone up a lot. It's interesting to measure that in the Cleantech space, this being the Cleantech investment outlook, the cost of capital for Cleantech has not gone up as much as interest rates have gone up in the aggregate environment. And we have to kind of analyze that and figure out why. What is it about our asset class? So the cost of capital is up much less than the incremental rise in treasury bonds. And costs of capital are relative at every moment. So one looks in the capital markets at spreads, which is the difference between one thing and the other thing. And the spreads between development, which is the riskiest early stage in building anything, versus the pre-commissioning, which is when you're building it and under construction, versus when it's seasoned, which is when it's operating and you're just buying those long-term cash flows. That spread itself has decreased, which you would not expect in an increasing interest rate environment. There is also, number two, a spread between single assets and portfolios of assets. And that's generally scaled to the aggregate amounts of dollars invested. Three, investors typically invest in single assets that become portfolios of assets, and they expect to and hope that when they have a larger portfolio, that they can refinance it at a lower interest rate because the risk has gone down. Remember, risk and return and duration. And that's called yield compression. And the final thing I'll mention this section on the cost of capital is that there's a fascinating form of finance called green bonds, right? So what is a green bond? It's green and
Whoops, Jeff, you've just frozen up a little bit.
am I back now?
Yes.
Yes, you were just discussing green bonds.
Okay, so green bonds are both green and a bond. So we understand the bond part, which is a very old school idea, which is you invest money and you expect a fixed return that's contracted. And the green bond is just saying that that which you're investing in has a green attribute to it. There's a lot of definitions of that. But the fascinating thing in this increasing interest rate environment is that green bonds compared to general bonds for very large, well-capitalized borrowers are less expensive, right? So there's a advantage that the capital market is giving at this moment in time in an increasing interest rate environment to that which is green. So Bank of America has a green bond that has a 26 basis point advantage over its other borrowings. Apple Computer gets a 20 basis point advantage. Visa recently got a 25 basis point advantage. And that's a lot of money for these very large organizations. At the level of a triple B rated enterprise, which is not as good as Apple and Bank of America, the average spread is 15 basis points. So it's fascinating that the green bonds have been a device which are generating increasingly attractive yields. So perhaps I'll take this as a moment to pause. We can talk about other things as the hour goes by, but thank you for the moment to have the first conversation.
Thank you, Jeff. Perfect overview. And we'll come back to you in a few minutes on permitting and interconnection queues and transmission. I know those are also topics that are near and dear to Steve Comello's heart. So Claudia, can you tell us from the perspective of your senior advisor and your massive investment funds, what are some of the key priorities that you are using now to evaluate key investments?
Sure, happy to. So as I started to mention before, so DIF really has three key pillars. And so some of the focus and priorities differ a little bit between the different pillars, but primarily we're focused on energy transition investments, pure renewables, IPP types of investments, and everything that would fall into the category of digitization. And a lot of what DIF looks at as an infrastructure investor, which is typically a longer term investor than, say, private equity, our whole period could be somewhere between 5 and 10 years, is traditionally in our core and core plus funds is sort of growth and stable cash flows for projects, transportation projects or companies, but also things like investments in new technology. So in the energy transmission and transitions phase, which is where I am, we're looking at things like fleet electrification, the ability to serve, specifically entities that are serving ports and rail, where we can bring electrified vehicles that can go back and forth to many, kind of repetitive routes and electrify that function. We're looking at the implementation of hydrogen, either on a blended basis or pure hydrogen deployment that can be combined, say, with some large scale wind assets, for example, in Oklahoma, where the cost of power during the night is negative. So if you can combine electrolyzers and storage, you can actually create some real opportunity and potentially transfer that power to low carbon fuel standard markets and other opportunities. And also things like battery and lithium recycling. There's another category where we're looking at where it's the opportunity, since rare minerals are so scarce and also under certain control by some other foreign powers that perhaps might be less cooperative in the current moment. So looking at opportunities to try to really recycle those, those existing batteries and to create ways to pull out the rare earth minerals and deploy them again. So those are all backdrops to the kinds of things that we're looking at. And then what are the types of priorities and how we think about investments are things like stable cash flows, growth opportunities, the ability to have repetitive project types. We have a major investment in some energy as a service businesses, which is really sort of where I grew up, essentially in the energy space, which are really trying to help develop behind the meter infrastructure for large scale users, hospitals, universities, airports, different types of infrastructure users, and where we can bring a lot of technological capabilities and management of the loads. So it's a combination of cleaner technologies, cleaner uses, better management of the power utilization on site, energy efficiency services, all sorts of different technologies to help them be more efficient.
Thank you, Claudia. Very helpful to get your insight. And you mentioned supply chain issues, which is, we've seen this jagged transition from really globalization where there were somewhat reliable supply chains to all of a sudden jagged geopolitics. Are we improving now on our strategies for supply chain, or is it still a very serious work in progress?
Well, I think it's evolving. Certainly, I think there's a huge push, partly in way because of the IRA, which has incentivized by providing an adder for local production of. So certainly, as Jeff would know well, in the solar industry, there's a lot of development of businesses for producing modules, producing polysilicon, producing cells. There's also battery factories that are being developed, and really there's a huge push to try to find ways to shorten the supply chain and provide sources of more reliable, shall we say, sources of suppliers. But there are still huge issues, certainly on everything related to electric switchgear and things like that. Are very long lead time items, have huge delays that could be 200% of the time that historically they were in terms of actually being received. And then some of the other issues are a shortage of labor, a shortage of materials. So some of the supply chain issues are getting solved. I think that the evolution of manufacturing to closer in locations will certainly be a huge help, both for geopolitical reasons as well as developing capabilities in the US for jobs and other kinds of knowledge, and then also just for speed and certainty of delivery of projects, which will hopefully in the end also help reduce the cost.
Thank you, Claudia. We're hoping that the gigantic infusion of capital that Jeff outlined is going to help us as quickly as possible with the supply chain and many of the other points that you
Can I add,
beautifully outlined. Yes, Jeff.
can I add a bookmark that we can come back to later and talk, because there's a level of complication in everything that Claudia is talking about in terms of how the government's implementing it. So on the one hand, there's all the domestic content stuff. And then the question is, what is the benefit of the manufacturing version versus the investment tax credit version for the operator? And the Treasury still hasn't decided if they'll allow both to exist simultaneously. But the manufacturing version for solar panels probably lowers the cost of that panel by about 5 cents a watt. So they have to show, which is a lot on a product that otherwise costs 35 to 40 cents a watt, a big percentage. But they have to show, the domestic manufacturers have to show that triple net, after their 5 cent a watt credit, that they can be that much less than the imported low-cost panels, number one. So it's not clear that that's more than a wash. Number two, then if you're developing and you want to get the extra 10% investment tax credit for domestic content, Treasury has to agree to let you do that. And the value of that through on a triple net cents per watt is 2 to 3 cents. So all these things add up, and they have to be measured. And at the moment, it's still, the jury's out and it's a little complicated.
Thank you for mentioning that, Jeff. And I hope all the panelists feel free to have this be as interactive a discussion as possible. And also for our participants, if you do have a question at any time, feel free to put that into the Q&A feature on this Zoom platform. But please stay away from the chat room because it's hard to monitor everything all at once. Bob, you are handling really two vital areas in terms of focusing on pollution, plastics and organics. What kind of progress or advances have you seen in the past 8 years since you founded Brightmark?
Yeah, Clint, it's a really good question, and I think it's very relevant. And actually, I'm very excited, and I'm excited because what I see here is pattern recognition. And as I mentioned in the intro, I previously worked in renewables, the first company I ran, and we built and sold it. So what I see in terms of waste management and then the solutions of the environmental outcomes we seek to improve is a playback to 10 to 15 years ago with renewables. And Jeff, I really like how you said there's, basically three constituencies that need to be integrated here. One is sort of the technology. The second is the regulatory support associated with that. And I would also add consumer sort of impetus or concern about these issues as well as part of that. So sort of the enablers. And then third, it's the capital markets, which then support the projects that we're talking about here, because they're extremely big ticket items. And when you're in infrastructure markets, the cost of capital is really important. So what I've seen in the last 8 years in each one of the areas is, as it relates to plastics and then organics, which organics is about methane, which is 84 times more contaminating the environment than CO2, so methane avoidance. And then we're, I think, mostly familiar with the fact that plastics, if you look back here, there's a plastic bag in the ocean behind me. One of the most fundamental issues that we have from an environmental standpoint. So with the confluence of the support there in the three different areas, we're now at the point where I think we should be excited. Plastics, for example, all the plastics that we use, not all of them are necessary, but many of them, in fact, the majority are necessary. We wouldn't be on our computers, we wouldn't have car seats, wouldn't be able to go to the hospital without the plastics that serve us. So we simply can't ban them. So the technology has been available, and our technology was invented back in the 80s, similar to solar cells being invented a long time before we hit the sort of tipping point here. So what's changed is, in addition to getting patents, is the integration of teams that understand how to build the projects, take the technology, get the governmental support and the consumer support in the local community to build these very large projects. And then finally, the financing aspect as well. Our first project is in Northeast Indiana, roughly a $400 million project to take every single one of the plastics we use and convert it into plastic feedstocks. The local community had a support associated with it about 4 years ago because of their concern about the plastics issue. And then we too actually utilized green bonds to finance that particular project as well. And I agree with you, Jeff, that there's now this interesting and I think appropriate sort of divergence of green bonds from straight bonds, and that is the cost of capital being lower for green bonds. And that's because we recognize that there's a difference in the environmental outcomes of these projects. And as a society, recognizing that and acknowledging it and being willing to pay a little bit more of a premium for something that's green, I think is one of the big shifts that we've seen. So technology has been there, and now it's being applied. The support regulatorily has completely changed. And on the consumer intent, what's interesting is, so our products could be turned into fuels or could be turned into the building blocks to remake plastics. When we started construction of a plant about 4 years ago in Indiana, the choice we had was fuels or nothing else. We are now in a situation where fuels are suboptimal for us, and it's a great thing because consumers are demanding of brand owners that they provide recycled content as it relates to plastics. So what that means is we get a greenium, as we call it, a premium price for producing a fully circular product versus delivering to the energy pools for things like diesel and gasoline. That's a great moment. And that's a huge change that we've had in the last 8 years. So my economics are better by delivering better environmental outcomes. That's really where I think we should be. And then, on the finance side, certainly the capital markets have recognized the viability of our solution and other solutions as well to solve a huge environmental crisis we have. So those are some of the thoughts, and it's just really exhilarating and exciting to think that we're now at a moment where we can actually look ahead and see that we can solve the plastic waste crisis, similar with greenhouse gases and organic materials.
Thank you. Bob, you mentioned sort of circularity. Can you go a little bit deeper on that with the application of your approach to diminishing the pollution of plastics?
Sure. So first for me, and this is really the thesis around founding Brightmark in 2016, because I'm very environmentally focused, is I believe that waste is sort of the root of the environmental outcomes that are bad that we create as humans. So circularity is a concept where you think about us taking from the environment and using, and then when we waste, we're proliferating waste into the environment. A circular solution is where you take something from the environment, you use it, and hopefully you reuse it first. But if you can't reuse it, then you find a way to process in as highly efficient a manner what you threw away, what you wasted, and turn it back into the original product. So what that allows us to do is keep wasted post-use materials out of the environment, number one. And number two, lowers the amount of taking from the environment a resource that's there. So you can see the circular nature of that. And with plastics, it applies just as well. We use plastics, we throw them away. Some plastics we shouldn't use. I'm not a big fan of plastic straws, but there are other plastics, a very small proportion that we can reuse. That's in that sort of 10% of the plastics we use range. And then for the rest, finding a way like our Brightmark technology, which can take all the plastics to then reprocess them from a chemical recycling standpoint to make that original product back. That's the circular nature of what we're doing.
Thank you, Bob. Really helpful. Steve, What type of policy changes do you feel we need to make clean energy projects more bankable?
Yeah. So the way that I think about, well, why are we even thinking about bankability to begin with? And I think it's helpful to just put into perspective how much money we actually need to put to work. So globally, we need something like $5 to $7 trillion net incremental capital from now until 2050 to get us where we need to go. In the US, it's something like $300 to $400 billion per year. And you think to yourself, well, that's not that much, right? The size of the US economy is measured in the tens of trillions. This should not be a problem. But the way to really look at it is essentially, what is the net annual non-financial corporate capital formation every year? And that's something about $300 billion, right? We're talking about a 1-to-1 ratio here. And that's the entire US economy basically aggregates that type of capital in a year. And so you have this $300 billion, and the need for the clean transition is something like $300 to $400 billion from now until 2050. So essentially, if you want to incentivize that money to be directed into all the things that we've been talking about to get us where we need to be, the projects have to be rock solid. And some of the projects that we're talking about in the short term are absolutely rock solid. Some other projects are not. It was mentioned before that there's going to be this long tail of decarbonization that's required. You know, it was somewhat feasible and easy to get us from 0 to 30%, 40% diffusion of renewable energy on the grid. But as we start moving further and further, and by far, renewable energy will be the horse to bet on in terms of what it's going to take to at least decarbonize the grid between, say, now and 2035, which is actually the goal, is to decarbonize the grid by 2035. You still need baseload power. You need long duration storage. You may need to keep some fossil generation going. And so what does that mean? That means that long duration storage needs to become commercialized. Nuclear needs to remain in the game, and you have to go and deploy more of it. Carbon capture and sequestration needs to be commercial. On top of all of that, you're still going to have industrial processes that are not quite there yet, and you might have to start thinking about carbon dioxide removal. Everything that I mentioned right now is not commercial. And so there's no incentive right now for the most risk-averse capital providers, which are the largest ones, the institutional investors, to get involved at that scale. So working backwards, you need to start thinking about what are the different kinds of policy mechanisms that you can think about that can start driving down the cost of demonstration, so that you actually get to a point where the first investors at scale can say yes. That if a deal comes across an investment committee or a capital's commitment committee, they essentially would say yes to it. We can get into that a little bit more, but that's at least the framing on why bankability is so important, because as we need to scale more and more, we're going to need a lot of money, and it will not just show up on its own.
Steve, you've also been focusing on themes of the importance of regional outlooks and also all of the above strategies in terms of technologies.
Right.
Can you elaborate on that a little bit too?
Yeah, absolutely. You know, is offshore wind a good strategy for Arizona, right? Is solar an excellent strategy for Seattle? Should we deploy bio or renewable natural gas in Alaska? Not every solution that we're developing is fit for the resources, the skill, the existing infrastructure, the knowledge base that is already endowed within certain parts of the country. No one solution is perfect, but the portfolio of them actually gets us where we need to go. We need to be able to develop and basically understand the boundary conditions that are there and double down on them, and then create interlinkages. Because again, no, you're not going to solve this all by just doing one solution. There's not going to be one dominant solution that you're going to have one of and zero of anything else. So that's why, for example, if you have solar and wind and hydro and nuclear and carbon capture attached to natural NGCC, you need to be able to move all of these clean electrons to where they need to go. And this goes back to an earlier theme, which is why transmission, interconnection, and expansion of the grid are so critical, because we can develop the generation technology. The demand is there. How you link the two is somewhat of an open question at this point.
And I know these policies also cover the demand side type of issues as well. And I've admired Ernie Moniz for sometimes pointing out the need for all of the above strategies when it hasn't always been the fad of the day. But I think it's really essential. I appreciate your underscoring that. Let's come back to Jeff on the point you made a moment ago, Stephen, and that is, Jeff, let's come back and talk about these pretty significant obstacles of siting, permitting, interconnection queues, transmission infrastructure.
Is that to Jeff or to me? That's to Jeff.
That's to Jeff. Are you able to, there we go.
I had to unmute, sorry. How many hours do we have to talk about that topic right now? So the truth, the underlying fact is that there's a lot of policy and law and process that underlies everything you just said. And as a gross generalization, all of the laws and policies were written in the 20th century for a different industry and for a different reason. So I'll start at something that because it's easy to understand, permitting, that we've spent a lot of time on, because as a solar developer, I need to permit land, and you can't build anything anywhere in the United States without a permit. You need a lot of other things, but you need a permit. We happen to build in rural communities. Land use is a major issue, and communities aren't structured to have a systematic thought about the use of land for decades for something that's new, even if it's temporary. And then you bring in the economic equation, where farmers quite often are at the low end earning $75 an acre, at the high end net earning $300 an acre, and the solar farms are providing them $1,000 or more per acre per year. So you've got the economic interest, where the renewable new infrastructure is radically more valuable to the landowner, which is in the face of the permitting. So permitting involves inflexible systems, which are state and local policies that often get more complicated because of how NEPA has, as a federal law from the 1970s, has grown. It's just very complicated. I'll mention quickly the transmission one. So we can't build, the $2 or $8 trillion, whatever you want to call it, without having the pipes to move the electrons around the country. The transmission grid today, of course, is also a 20th century grid. It was designed for a different grid and a different purpose. Just to, quote, electrify everything, which a lot of policymakers and a lot of these laws are talking about, requires doubling or tripling the grid. Doubling or tripling the grid, which is a physical thing to talk about, takes gazillions of dollars and a lot of time. The standard answer as to how long it takes to bring to market a transmission anything in the United States of America is 10 years. So if you tell the policymakers they've just passed all these lovely laws and everything else can happen except nothing can happen until the transmission is upgraded, and that's a 10-year pause. That's a total policy breakdown. It's a total policy breakdown. So somehow the plural we have to figure out how to cause transmission to happen in 2 years. 2 has to be the new 10. We just have to figure out how to change the rule set. And that's very complicated and radically easier said than done. But transmission has to change, permitting has to change, and I'd be happy to go on, but maybe someone else has something to say.
I just want to play off of that, getting back to my point on bankability, that my contention is that solar, especially utility scale solar, 100% bankable. It's great. But if the idea is that we need to wait 10 years and we're already transmission constrained, we could actually, it would actually look like an inverted U. We've gone from solar not being that bankable to highly bankable. Then it could become unbankable again, because you're going to be stuck in an interconnection queue if you can get your permitting for your project for a very long time. And you don't make that much money on development. You really make your money when you're actually operating, and it just becomes a riskier bet. And so you could see one future, which I don't want, but you could see one future where essentially transmission does not get built as fast as we need. And then you're focused much more on local or much more energy dense options, right? And that could lead you more into a fossil future, perhaps with more carbon capture. But even that is difficult because you need to put the captured carbon somewhere. So, overall, the whole midstream, moving electrons, moving hydrogen, moving CO2, so electrons and molecules, how you move them, that entire panoply needs to be figured out immediately.
It's such an important point. This has been an unresolved issue for a long, long time. And we're at a crisis point now. I mean, look at what Europe was just able to accomplish post-Russian invasion of Ukraine, where all of a sudden they're bringing on gas projects. It might have taken 10 years to get approved within 18 months, things like that. So we have to solve this problem, and you can't just favor one single technology or group of technologies, as we discussed earlier. So I hope there will be some really serious policy development. We've seen a lot of talk, but no action for many years. Jeff.
Look what's going on in PJM. So, PJM, which is a small part of the country, which I think is 50% of our entire United States population, has had a moratorium on new permits. Why have they had and it's fascinating to sort of look at the underlying reason. It's sort of not really a policy reason. It's that they were too congested in the permitting office. They said, okay, to permit, you have to go through all these steps. We only have so many trained human beings who can do it, and they're already overwhelmed. We don't know how to hire more people or how to scale that. That's a fascinating systems problem. I want to go one level down from transmission and talk about the distribution grid also, because from a renewable energy and from our point of view for Cleantech, a lot happens at the distribution level, not at in addition to the macro transmission level. And again, so much about moving things around is in the rural communities, and it's rural to urban, because you can't site in an urban area because of the nature of the land. So you have to site in rural and bring the electrons to the urban, and that's a major task that we all have. So again, those rural distribution grids were built for very logical reasons to support farming communities, right? And in 1960, when you were looking at the demand in some rural farming community, no one ever imagined that you were going to put tens or hundreds of megawatts of solar in the middle of those farms. No one really, shame on them, but they didn't think about that. And the distribution grids are just as weak as the transmission grids and need to be fixed fast.
And Jeff, that is a subject for another day for us, but compounding what you just mentioned is cyber issues that are exacerbated now, and also the tremendous amount of technology that's going to have to, data, it's going to have to transfer. A number of experts I really respect feel that you can't modernize the distribution grid until you modernize telecommunications and communication systems. We're doing a lot with Anterix, which really has some exciting LTE network that they're bringing to some leading utilities, but that's another area that's going to have much more development. Claudia, I'm anxious to get back to you and to begin discussing something that Emma Han and I and other members of this think tank care so much about, and that is smart cities. And what investments have you been making that are contributing to smarter cities, with maybe with emphasis on digital and alternative energy?
Sure. Well, recently, DIF, we had the good fortune of making a few acquisitions. One is for a geothermal company called Diversio in Canada. And Diversio's focus is on providing geothermal development facilities for multifamily housing. So the idea is that, and traditionally, I mean, obviously geothermal has been done at a very large scale, or it's been done in a single family home. But really the opportunity here is to provide that kind of ubiquitous heating and cooling systems. And they have, not only 25 to 30 already functioning projects, but they have an enormous pipeline of project opportunities in and around Ontario and other parts of Canada. Another avenue, I think, touches a little bit on what you've been discussing previously, is companies like Air Tower, which is another recent investment we made on basically fiber to the building. So it is opportunities to bring kind of different types, not only just data, but other types of powered systems. Maybe potentially could be a way of distributing localized energy at some point, but being able to provide more support to buildings for internet and other data uses. And we're also focused quite heavily, as I mentioned before, on looking at fleet electrification. Some of the investments that DIF has made to date in some of these more emerging technology areas have been more in Europe, because in general, the European market is more advanced than the US market in bringing some of these technologies to bear, but very focused on, having the case studies functioning in Europe, and then taking that perspective and knowledge and trying to invest in businesses domestically. I do think fleet electrification, because that's a huge component of our EV infrastructure, is going to be very, very important. And I think the smarter cities are looking at hydrogen buses and providing a kind of a more robust charging network available. I mean, doing some of the things that are really needed to encourage adoption of electric vehicles. And then, of course, when you use electric vehicles today, your grid power in general is coming from dirty sources. So trying to incentivize the use of other forms of renewable energy or semi-renewable energy. I agree with Stephen. There's going to need to be more nuclear. I mean, I believe Stephen said that earlier. I think that we're going to have to think more broadly about our energy sources. I think hydrogen, again, I believe is a huge opportunity. Fossil fuels, yes, will be here for a while, some of which, because that's not only for power, but also for, the utilization of plastics, rubber. I mean, there's a million different products that go into that are used for oil and gas. But I think blending, that right now you have to blend an awful lot of hydrogen into natural gas to make that truly a cleaner fuel. But I think more and more the technologies will be there to help encourage that. And, obviously some of the other things, while problematic, I'd say cities like New York, which have adopted local law 94 with green roofs. Clearly it's hard, especially in a place like New York. There's only so many solar panels one can put on a roof, right? I worked on a project for the new international terminal at JFK Airport. Really hard to put solar panels on a roof where you have planes flying and landing and birds possibly going into, into the roof of the airport. So you have certain constraints, and then local law 97 as well. You know, that's an interesting, you know, I think it's important when we look at the initiatives that are being made, but then there's the practical elements of what cities can do and who's bearing the cost of those improvements and those requirements. So broadly, I'm excited by a lot of the initiatives, but believe we have a long way to go, as my colleagues have previously been mentioning. I've just been nodding in silence.
Claudia, you've mentioned New York. What are some of the other smarter cities that are using some of the technologies that you just mentioned?
Well, I'm based in Washington, D.C. area, and I would say I live in Montgomery County, which is just a suburb of Washington, D.C. And I think they've actually been a tremendous example of really trying to move the needle on. They have adopted not only hydrogen buses and electric buses, they've adopted a sort of charging stations that are essentially solar powered, charging and storage for the bus network, even solar washing stations. They are very transit oriented. They're trying to increasingly encourage more and more transit. They have a lot of difficult building codes, which, you know, when you're on the permitting side, I'm sure it makes it very challenging, but on the flip side of it does, you know, yield better, more efficient building from a consumption of power perspective.
Thank you. Bob, I'm anxious to hear a little bit about some of the obstacles you're facing with this amazing approach that you're advancing. And while we have Steve Comello here to solve all our problems from a policy standpoint, what's in your way?
Yeah, first off, I'm long-term optimistic. So when I tell you a few of the things that are in the way, don't let it take away from the fact that I just believe that we as humans have the power in our hands to solve these problems. So yeah, so what are the things that are keeping us in the way? Because we're in early adoption of the alternative to the use and landfill or throw out the plastics problem, we have a waste infrastructure and ecosystem that isn't really geared toward managing large amounts of waste streams in a different way. And that's one of our biggest problems we have. So a couple of things there. One, there are specific laws, generally locally, that govern how you manage waste. And as we've just talked about, we've got 20th century laws on that were created, laws, regulation that was created on the grid system. We have a similar thing here. The infrastructure and waste was never designed to do anything other than throw in a big hole in the ground. And so what we're struggling with is, how do we change it? Now, part of the change is regulatory. And I think the regulatory side of that is interesting, because I think the regulators move much slower, and it is a blunt instrument generally, right? Just like the implementation of domestic content rules that we have the opportunity for, blunt instrument, and then build out of the grid for it as well if we're going to go all electric. It's the same thing. Good ideas, but how do we make it happen on a local basis? And so I think the obstacle we have is educating a lot of folks on a local basis that this is a better way to pull plastics out of the environment and do it in an economic fashion. The other one is similar to siting projects in rural areas for renewables. Listen, who wants to have effectively a petrochemical facility, which is what ours looks like and operates similar to, in their backyard? So the onus is on us to ensure that we're looking at environmental justice issues as we cite, but we also need support from communities and most likely states to say, this is important because we've got a waste crisis. Where do we cite these projects? And so I think that's incredibly important as well. So waste hierarchy, reconfiguring it, state, local programs, and then us handcrafting Unfortunately, having to handcraft with waste haulers, industrials that have post-industrial plastics, there's a lot of reconfiguring, and it takes incredible amount of work, and it will take time. And I lay that against the need. Right. In the US, we use about 40 million tons a year of plastics. And the last data that came out is we only recycle about 5% of it. So we've got a time frame that we need to solve for. So how do we change the waste hierarchy? The other one is, and I'd love to get your thoughts on this too, Steve, is the bankability aspect. And I agree, having been in renewables, that utility scale solar right now is bankable, but there was a time when it wasn't as bankable. That's where we are now. And the question is, how do we solve for that when we have an imminent crisis we need to deal with? Because you can get local support, you can have the technology, but if you can't finance it, and these are very large projects, then sounds like a good idea, but it's never going to get done, and not in time. And I think that sort of valley of death financing, as some would call it, is one of the biggest issues we have in deploying any technology, whether it be ours or not. So how do you do that? And that may not be very answerable, but I'm curious, Steve, what are your thoughts on how you take a great idea, great opportunity, but isn't at serial number 3,000 or 3 million yet?
Yeah. So my general model is that you are eventually creating a social good here. So it's in the public interest to, I'm originally from Canada, so have more shots on goal, to basically fund the innovation and the demonstration, and then collect some data and see where tweaks need to be made. And can you really create a credible learning curve and then a trajectory off of that you can actually deploy at scale? The classic model is what happened with solar in California. You had an ITC, which was a federal carrot, but then you had a state stick, which was you had to go, the state basically told the utilities that it actually doesn't matter what the price is. You have to go and buy a certain percentage of the electrons from certain renewable sources. And the cost got socialized. It got socialized in a way that is probably a little less efficient because it was on the backs of ratepayers or customers and not the entire state, like a tax would be. But essentially that kind of mechanism where you have goals, which this administration has set pretty ambitious goals. You have sets of carrots that get certain supply motivated, but you really need to incent the demand. And in some cases, that's going to come from grants or sticks, which is a weird kind of grant if you squint.
Steve, it's interesting you say that about the California program, because I was at PG&E, the CFO of the utility. I remember as we were getting started, it was 20% by 2020. We were scared. We were absolutely scared we would never get there. Well, guess what happened? All the above that you just mentioned made it so that we blew it away. And that's where I think the hope comes from. But what we need is that support, to garner the support in order to make that happen. It's interesting. Another one too, I would add to that would be, I do think the federal government, through the Department of Energy, their loan programs and other grants, I think can be incredibly useful. In fact, the current head of the loan program, many of you may know him, Jigar Shah, he came out of the renewable industry, right? He was one of the co-founders of Sun Edison. And I think he is a breath of fresh air in the loan program office. They're leading that. That's another good tool as well to get unstuck some of these stuck things. And what Jigar was telling me is, I think it's on their website too, they have a default rate of just over 3%, which is well below commercial. So somehow it's working for the DOE as well.
I think LPO is fantastic. I think Jigar's doing an excellent job there. I think what has been unlocked through BIL and IRA for LPO has been excellent. I still think we need a little bit more because the other capital pool or structure you need is equity. And I would contend that debt is really good if you're on the cusp for commercialization. But if you're in the demonstration phase, you need a little bit more low-cost equity, otherwise known as zero-cost equity, which is known as a grant. And I think if there is opportunity, and this would obviously have to be congressional, and you know, this is a lot more work than just saying something in a panel. I think in IRA 2.0, that is a little bit more grant focused, and you don't need much. We're talking about single-digit billions of dollars to get a few different technologies over that tipping point, and to get the credible learning rate, and also getting some data so that disinterested investors would say, look, this has been built before. This is not a one-off or a science project that they're not interested in getting involved with.
Let me jump back in and underscore a couple of things that I've heard you guys talking about. You know, so this whole thing about what happened in California was all having to do with net metering 1.0, and the utilities either had to build or they had to pay, and the pay was the alternative compliance price, right? So that was built as an economic transfer, and you know, it was not a requirement that they pay it. They could have built, and it's just that they weren't in the phase of where that is. New York has worked really hard, I think, to create net metering 2.0 with their VDER, value distributed energy resources, which is a more complex formula that is meant to be a broader way of charging, as opposed to just the alternative compliance price. And they've recently announced something which is new, which is, you can't really look it up yet because it's just words. It's not yet a policy, which is called cap and invest. So they've gone from alternative compliance prices to value distributed energy resources to cap and invest. And it's good that that state governments are incubating ideas to try and create a more economically viable way of having a market pay for things, as opposed to just grants. And back to a comment that Claudia made, which I wanted to insert on, Local Law 97 is so far an example of something that seemed like a good idea, but it's a failure in implementation. So Local Law 97 imposes a cost on a real estate owner of a certain size that fails to get renewable energy, but then they didn't follow through with the transmission grid that they were supposed to do through the Tier 4 auction in any way that made sense. So if you're a building owner today, you simply can't do it. So here's a piece of data on an unintended consequence in New York City of Local Law 97. I was with a partner of a well-known accounting firm last week, and they're literally moving their long-term prominent headquarters from Park Avenue to another part of town, because the Park Avenue building, which probably everyone in this webinar has been in, literally is not compliant. It's a lovely building, but it's not compliant with and cannot be compliant with Local Law 97. So the cost of rent there is going up, and it's no longer, the whole building is no longer economically viable because of Local Law 97. That's an unintended consequence. The city of New York did not want people to leave Park Avenue to go to another part of town to go into a new building, but they created an adverse economic effect. Clint, we can't hear you.
Thank you.
Well, I was just going to
Yeah.
jump in on what Jeff said. I totally agree. I think that those are smart laws, but I think that New York City is a challenge in and of itself. I mean, the grid you can't get from one side. When we were developing the terminal at JFK, and with requirements of the Port Authority to be able to produce to have a certain amount of renewable energy, we couldn't produce enough on site given the roofs and the other challenges. And you can't actually get electrons from up the Hudson Valley to, Jamaica, Queens, because the grid, there is no transmission grid. It's everything is so congested. So I agree. I think the question is, what are the right policies, and then how do you follow that up with all the other things you've been talking about? Is you have to have, it's not just policy in a vacuum, it is policy combined with transmission and distribution lines and favorable capital structures that can allow for these things to be implemented. Sorry, Clint.
No, I'm glad you made that comment, and we're going to come back to you in a moment, but I do want to read one of the questions we've received from one of our participants and give you all a shot at answering that. And this is from Ben DaCosta. To what extent is artificial intelligence employed for clean energy advancement? And as you're collecting your thoughts, I do want to mention that my dear friend Llewellyn King is really investing in this issue right now. He just wrote a piece in Forbes, did a discussion of it with the U.S. Energy Association, which is recorded, and he's going to be doing a virtual webinar on this topic pretty quickly. So I'll, if you send me an email, I'll make sure you get that information. But who would like to respond to this important question? Jeff, do you want to start?
I can start. And I don't, like every company that doesn't use or say they're using artificial intelligence, their stock price just went down 30%. So whatever you're doing, use artificial intelligence and figure it out. I don't know whether we use artificial intelligence or real intelligence and real smarts, but what we do at my company is use a lot of data-driven decision making, which uses large computers with dozens of databases and cross analyzes factors across them to figure out on a desktop what the outcome in terms of cost and technology and policy and impact will be on the capital markets of a lot of multivariate decisions. So when you're developing and doing both any one of the technologies, whether it's cabs or trailers or charging stations or anything to do with fleet that Claudia was talking about, or the solar stuff, and we're doing both sides of that. We're doing fleet and facilities and a few other technologies. How you analyze the bankability of an investment in a zip code at a location is very complicated. And we've used a form of intelligence. It's real intelligence, but maybe it's artificial intelligence to increase the speed and accuracy of the outcomes.
Thank you, Jeff. I think it's going to be essential for the entire focus on distributed energy resources to be able to understand and move data at the rate that's going to be needed. And I'm seeing the utility industry now beginning to awaken to this vital technology. Claudia, do you want to comment?
Yes. Well, I guess I mentioned, following on from what Jeff was saying, I think another important area of really data, maybe perhaps separate from pure artificial intelligence, is ESG. Organizations are now grappling with this whole question of how do I measure, what are my scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions? How do I measure them? What can I do about them? And so I think that's a huge area where organizations are starting, and in a way, the oil and gas industry is kind of at the front end of that because of a variety of reasons. But across the board, organizations are trying to say, what's my footprint? Who are my suppliers? How do I think about this? And it's very, very data driven in terms of first understanding and then trying to figure out how to mitigate.
Thank you. Yes, Steve.
So one factoid, November 2022, which was 7 months ago. What happened then? That was the public release of ChatGPT, which was the first widely adopted AI app for the masses. And what that has done in the data center world has basically, to some extent, upended how they think about data center design and location and power requirements. Because how you actually use your data center for computing power, for inference and for training is much different than just an enterprise cloud and putting that in a data center. So the power requirements have increased. The hardware requirements have increased. The software to levelize all of this is still a work in progress. But this is going to be, if AI is going to be a tool that pervades our life, the computing requirements for that are going to be substantial. And you're going to start running into problems like you see in Loudoun County, which is just up the road from where I am. And I'm a cyclist, so on weekends I go up there and I'm a mammal, a middle-aged man in Lycra running around or cycling around up there. And Loudoun County is the greatest concentration of data centers in the world. And you're getting to the point now where there's so much clean energy demand that you're getting an interconnection queue on the demand side. And that is a major issue when it comes to these hyperscalers like Apple, Google, Facebook, or sorry, Meta and so forth, Microsoft, that they're unable to fulfill some of the computing requirements that are being asked of them. And now they have to think about if it's not clean energy that I can get from the grid because I can't interconnect, are there behind the meter applications that I should be thinking about? And that's just not small. We're talking about 200-300 megawatts at a shot. And if you're having multiple of those in a geographically concentrated area, because that's where the fiber is, very interesting ramifications for certain parts of the country.
You know, I had a birthday recently. A good friend of mine asked ChatGPT to write a poem for me, gave certain information like the quatrains and things like that. And within a minute, it apparently spit out this extraordinary poem that had a scary amount of information about me. So I understand a lot of enterprising college students now are using ChatGPT for all sorts of projects. But Bob, did you want to comment on AI, or should we move forward in our conversation?
Well, I mean, my reaction is, I think, you know, all the three discussers of the topic were on it. And I would say, Steve, yours is really interesting to me, because that's sort of one of my thoughts is, what are the knock-on effects of AI, right? And it's another version, although often misquoted, the Moore's Law effect. And that curve keeps going, and I almost wonder if it ultimately hits sort of that y-axis, that vertical axis, because we're changing so fast. And I think that impacts all of us in what we're doing here. You know, as it relates specifically to the business, not the knock-on impacts, there's a lot of power at how we look at things like solving locations, because it's a bit of you know, industrial engineering problem here. And when you apply AI techniques to it, you get very interesting sort of solutions, right? So you've got feedstock supply, you got offtake, you've got supply of other things, you got workforce requirement, a lot of variables, and the power of sorting through and determining viability is pretty amazing. The other one that's an interesting one as well is as it relates to our technology that we operate, both renewable natural gas and on the plastic renewal side with the pyrolysis technology, is we've got a lot of operating data points. And we've had conversations with parties like Google has a team, and then some other companies about applying AI so that we can predictively think about how much stocks we keep, when can we predict that things are going out, because if we go down, then that's a loss of economic sustainability and providing environmental sustainability. So those are some of the ones sort of inside the walls that we will deploy. It's just a question of when and how. And I think ChatGPT is pretty cool and amazing. So,
you know, Bob, earlier you mentioned Jigar Shah and the LPO. I'm actually meeting with him tomorrow. I chair the board of the Alliance to Save Energy. And we're going to be talking to him about energy efficiency. We feel that demand side type of issues are very, very vital as part of this conversation. I agree with Steve that the LPO is just one part of the solution, but I'm kind of in awe of all that Jigger has been doing. I like to follow him on LinkedIn now. He's posting a couple of things every day that are just remarkable.
Yeah. Yeah, pretty amazing. And I think that's a testament to getting the right folks in the right spot. And, Jigger was one of us. And now he's in a role where he can enable for goodness, for a good public cause. And he's done a phenomenal job. So when you meet with him, tell him I said hi.
I will do that.
Let's just have the kumbaya moment and have a moment of pause to celebrate Jigger.
Yes, 100%.
Yeah. Well, did you know that
It's
the DOE,
yes.
I think, is the largest funder of energy projects in the world? I think I'd heard that.
Yeah.
It wouldn't surprise me.
Yeah.
And it's interesting that he was such a successful entrepreneur and then really came in for pure government service to focus policy on, at one of the most important times in our history, as I think Jeff pointed out in the beginning of our conversation. Let me do this. We just have a couple of minutes left. Each of you have been phenomenal. I used to be part of an ocean racing team where we'd be out in the middle of the ocean and we'd see a sunset and somebody would say, man, that's the most beautiful sunset I've ever seen. Next night, same thing. I'm getting to the point now where for our webinars, I'm starting to say, that was the best webinar we've ever had. And this is certainly one of them. And why don't I give you each kind of spontaneously just a minute to say, to make one emphatic point. What's the most compelling point that you would like to communicate very succinctly to the audience? Because you've been doing such a beautiful job in this discussion. Jeff, do you want to start us out on that?
I'll just underscore, thank you. And thank you again for organizing this and for hosting Dentons and Keystone. I'll just underscore the intractable challenges, because if we're going to get this done and invest $10 trillion, we need to work on siting, permitting, transmission, interconnection, litigation. These are hard problems that affect our clean energy economy, our energy economy. And with no change to them, we cannot achieve energy national security. And we haven't talked much about national security, but this is not just about the energy grid, it is about our national security. I said earlier, 2 is the new 10. We have to reinvent processes and compress schedules. That's all that we mean by 2 is the new 10. Reinvent processes and compress schedules. And if we don't do that simultaneously, we won't get where we need to go. The capital markets prefer simplicity. They know they need to know the time of schedule and what the cash flows are, and our energy future depends on it. So let's get on with it. And thanks for giving us a chance to talk.
Perfect piece of advice. Thank
Yep.
you, Jeff. Claudia?
Sure. Well, I certainly agree with all of the concerns that we face, but I guess I will reiterate what I think Bob said earlier, which is I'm actually really excited. I think that if nothing else, COVID taught us that we could produce vaccines in a time frame that no one thought was ever possible, right? So I think there is finally a recognition, not of everyone, but more ubiquitously, that climate change is real, that we really have all of these things that were known, for years and years. But I think that when we can rally around finally, a problem, that we have the minds and the ability to get it done. And I believe that there's so many fascinating new technologies that are out there that can be commercialized. I think there is a lot of capital. I think one of the comments earlier about green bonds is all true, but I would also say the cost of equity, despite all of the issues that we've had in globally and in our inflationary environment, has not changed, has not gone up. So I think there is a tremendous amount of capital circling these kinds of projects and initiatives, a real desire to get things done for a lot of social purpose, triple bottom line kind of perspective. So I'm cautiously optimistic that we're going to get there, that we're not going to leave the world for our children and grandchildren quite the mess that we're facing right now.
Thank you, Claudia. Great job today. Bob, would you like to go next?
Yeah, sure. Obviously, Claudia, I support the let's have hope message here. I'm very hopeful. And I think to get there, I won't go into the super tactical things. I think we should be curious. And when I say be curious, one of the things that's in my mind is that let's not be beholden to any one thing that we are doing. And there are great minds out there that none of us have touched yet that will help us solve these issues. And I think we should have an abundance mentality, be focused on the mission, which is to create better environmental outcomes while also creating economic sustainability. And let's high five the folks who are out here doing and just realize that our 1 or 2 or whatever it is, things that we're working on isn't the total solution. And so let's, as a passion, support others who are seeking better environmental outcomes.
Thank you, Bob. As a fellow optimist, I'll just say nicely done. And Stephen, can you close us out?
So 100% everything I've heard. Look, the recognition, so we're going to get there. We will get there. How we get there is an open question, but we're going to have to deploy, as Secretary Granholm has said. There is increasing recognition that climate, security, and social progress are one conversation, and we can solve all 3 at once. And that's going to take pragmatism. And I'm going to quote Lord Brown, who is the chair of our advisory committee. And he said, pragmatism at speed is better than perfection that comes too late. So if we have that in the back of our mind, then I think we would be a lot more collaborative and we'll get the solutions that we need.
I think your sentence, climate, energy security, and social progress need to be part of one conversation is the perfect way to conclude this extraordinary conversation. And so on behalf of our audience, I'm just going to give you an ovation and thank you. And I look forward to seeing each of you very soon. Great job today.